There is a moment in every narcissistic dynamic when the script is supposed to go a certain way. They withdraw, they go cold, they create distance. And then they wait. They wait for the panic. They wait for the tears. They wait for the desperate message that says, "Please don't leave me." Because in their world, control is proven when you crumble. But this time you did not, and that changes everything. You have to understand something important. When a narcissistic person pulls away, it is rarely about needing space or clarity. It is about power. It is about watching you doubt yourself. It is about seeing how far you will bend to keep them. They expect the begging because begging confirms their superiority. It tells them they still own your self-worth. But you chose something different. You chose restraint over reaction. You chose dignity over desperation. You chose to sit with the discomfort instead of trying to fix what was never yours to fix. That silence was not weakness. It was regulation. It was growth. It was the first sign that you were no longer operating from fear of abandonment, but from awareness of your value. And when you did not beg, something profound happened. The power dynamic shifted. The control they thought they had began to erode. Because narcissistic systems depend on emotional chaos. They depend on your pursuit. When you stop chasing, the illusion cracks. This is not about winning a game. This is about reclaiming yourself. This is about breaking a cycle that may have defined you for years. When you refused to beg, you sent a message to them. But more importantly, you sent a message to yourself. I will not shrink to keep someone who is comfortable watching me suffer. That is where your real strength begins. There comes a point in a narcissistic dynamic when you realize that every reaction you give becomes fuel. Every explanation, every defense, every tear is studied, measured, and used. For a long time, you may have believed that if you just found the right words, the right tone, the right amount of patience, things would change. You chased clarity. You chased repair. You chased the hope that if you loved harder, they would soften. But what you were really chasing was approval from someone who thrived on your instability. The day you stopped chasing was not dramatic. It was not loud. It did not come with a grand announcement. It came with exhaustion, a deep, cellular exhaustion that whispered, I cannot keep abandoning myself to hold on to someone who is committed to misunderstanding me. Your silence was not passive. It was powerful. It was the first time you recognized that engagement was not the same as connection. You began to see that every time you ran after them when they withdrew, you reinforced the idea that your worth was negotiable, that your love could be tested, that your presence could be withheld as punishment. And something inside you shifted. You understood that chasing someone who tries to break you is a form of self-betrayal. It teaches your nervous system that chaos is normal and that anxiety is love. It convinces you that if you are not fighting for the relationship, you are failing. But you were never failing. You were surviving a system designed to keep you small. When you chose silence, you chose regulation, overreaction. You chose to sit with the discomfort instead of scrambling to fix what was strategically broken. That restraint required strength. It required you to tolerate the uncertainty of not knowing what they would do next. It required you to let go of the fantasy that this time they would finally understand your pain. And in that space, something remarkable happened. You began to understand your value, independent of their validation. You saw that your worth does not increase when someone calls you back, and it does not decrease when someone walks away. You realized that love should not feel like a performance review. Your silence disrupted the pattern. It removed the reward. It forced the dynamic to confront a new reality, where you were no longer participating in your own diminishment. That is not weakness. That is boundary. That is self-respect. You stopped chasing what tried to break you, and in doing so, you stopped breaking yourself. You allowed the discomfort to rise without rushing to soothe it through self-sacrifice. You let the quiet teach you that you can survive abandonment, that you can withstand withdrawal, that you can stand still while someone attempts to provoke movement. And that stillness became strength, because the most powerful shift in your life was not when they changed. It was when you did. It was when you decided that your energy would no longer be spent proving your value to someone invested in devaluing you. It was when you understood that silence is not the absence of power, but the embodiment of it. A declaration that you will no longer participate in dynamics that demand your desperation as proof of love, and that you are finally choosing yourself over the chaos that once convinced you that survival meant chasing someone who was committed to watching you fall. In narcissistic dynamics, there is always a script. It is subtle, but it is predictable. They withdraw, they criticize, they create confusion, and then they wait. They wait for you to panic. They wait for you to over-explain. They wait for you to plead for connection, as if connection is a privilege they generously grant. The entire structure is built on one assumption, that you will choose desperation over dignity. For a long time, maybe you did, not because you were weak, but because you were invested. You believed in repair. You believed in accountability. You believed that love meant fighting for the relationship. So when they pulled away, your nervous system sounded an alarm. Fix it. Call them. Apologize even if you are unsure what you did. Make it right. Do not lose this. But here is what you eventually saw with clarity. Every time you begged, you reinforced the imbalance. You confirmed that they could destabilize you, and you would still reach for them. You taught them that distance increased your pursuit, and that pursuit became their proof of power. The day you chose dignity, you interrupted that reinforcement. Dignity does not shout. It does not perform. It does not issue ultimatums. Dignity is quiet self-alignment. It is the decision that your worth will not be negotiated under emotional duress. It is recognizing that if someone needs you to crumble, to feel significant, the problem is not your effort, but their emptiness. When you did beg, the script faltered. The expected reaction did not arrive. The tears, the frantic messages, the self-blame they were prepared to receive never came. Instead, there was steadiness. There was space. There was the unsettling reality that you were no longer willing to trade self-respect for temporary reassurance. That shift was not just external, it was internal. You stopped viewing their withdrawal as evidence of your inadequacy. You began to see it as a tactic. And once you name a tactic, it loses some of its power. You no longer rushed to fix what was engineered to destabilize you. You paused. You reflected. You allowed the silence to exist without filling it with self-criticism. This is where rewriting the script truly begins. You move from reaction to response. You move from fear to discernment. You understand that begging does not secure love. It only secures a role in a dynamic where you are perpetually trying to earn what should be freely given. Dignity says, I will not audition for a position in my own life. And something else happens when you choose dignity. You begin to trust yourself. You trust that if someone walks away because you would not chase them, that departure is information. You trust that relationships built on imbalance cannot become healthy through increased sacrifice. You trust that the discomfort of not begging is temporary, but the erosion of self-respect is cumulative. Not begging was not about pride. It was about self-preservation. It was about recognizing that desperation keeps you attached to potential, while dignity anchors you in reality. It was about stepping out of a role where your pain was expected and stepping into one where your boundaries are non-negotiable. And in that moment, the narrative changed. You were no longer the person scrambling for scraps of validation. You were the person standing firm in your worth, understanding that any relationship requiring your humiliation as proof of love is not a relationship that deserves your devotion, and that choosing dignity over desperation is the beginning of a life where your value is no longer up for debate. One of the greatest miscalculations in a narcissistic dynamic is this. They believe you will always come back. They believe your empathy is endless, your patience is permanent, and your tolerance for confusion is proof that you cannot detach. They mistake your capacity for love as an inability to leave, and so they push, they test, they withdraw, they provoke. Because in their mind, you will look back, but the strength they never anticipated was not loud, dramatic, or vengeful. It was steady. It was regulated. It was the quiet decision that you would no longer participate in a cycle that required you to shrink in order to stay. Walking away without L. Oaking back is not about indifference. It is about clarity. It is about finally understanding that closure does not come from one more conversation, one more explanation, one more attempt to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding you. You realize that every time you turned back, you reopened a door that led to the same room. And you were tired of that room. You were tired of overanalyzing texts, tired of justifying disrespect, tired of managing moods that were never yours to manage. At some point, the emotional cost became undeniable. You recognized that love should not feel like a constant audition, that safety should not feel like walking on glass, that connection should not require you to abandon your instincts. The moment you stopped looking back, you disrupted more than the relationship. You disrupted the identity they had assigned you. You were no longer the fixer, no longer the chaser, no longer the one who absorbs blame to keep the peace. You stepped out of the role that kept them powerful. And here is what makes that so threatening. When you walk away without looking back, there is nothing left to control, no reaction to provoke, no apology to extract, no emotional spiral to trigger. Your absence becomes a boundary they cannot negotiate. Your silence becomes a mirror reflecting their lack of influence. That is the strength they never prepared for. This kind of strength is built slowly. It is built in therapy sessions, in late-night realizations, in the quiet moments when you admit to yourself that the chaos is not love. It is built when you start trusting your discomfort instead of overriding it. It is built when you accept that potential is not reality and that hope cannot substitute for accountability. Walking away without looking back means you grieve what you wanted, not what you actually had. You accept that the fantasy was powerful, but the pattern was harmful. You allow yourself to feel the loss without using it as an excuse to return. That requires emotional maturity. That requires tolerating loneliness without reaching for toxicity as relief. And in doing so, you reclaim your energy. You reclaim your time. You reclaim the parts of yourself that were fragmented in the constant effort to stabilize something inherently unstable. You begin to see that your peace is not boring. It is sacred. The strength they never expected was not your anger. It was your detachment. It was your ability to say this no longer serves me, and mean it. It was your refusal to check their social media, to respond to breadcrumbs, to re-enter conversations designed to pull you back into confusion. You did not look back because you finally understood that looking back kept you tied to a version of yourself that accepted less than you deserve. And walking forward without turning around was not coldness or cruelty, but the clearest declaration that you are no longer willing to sacrifice your stability for a dynamic that thrives on your instability, and that your future deserves all the energy you once spent trying to survive a past that was never going to change. And this is where your real transformation settles in. Not in the dramatic exit, not in the final conversation, but in the quiet days that follow, when you realize you are breathing differently, sleeping differently, thinking differently. The absence of chaos no longer feels unfamiliar. It feels earned. You begin to notice that your mind is not consumed with decoding someone else's behavior. Your energy is not drained by rehearsing arguments that never lead to resolution. You are no longer bracing for impact. That constant state of hypervigilance fades, and in its place comes something steady and grounded. Peace. You understand now that strength is not proving you can endure mistreatment. Strength is deciding you do not have to. Strength is recognizing that love without respect is attachment, not intimacy, and you are no longer willing to confuse the two. Walking away without looking back was never about them losing you. It was about you finding yourself. It was about choosing a future where your worth is assumed, not debated. And once you taste that kind of self-trust, you will never again mistake chaos for passion or control for love.